From the chapter reading, you know that biological diversity, or biodiversity, is essentially the variety of life on Earth. A common misconception is that biodiversity simply refers to the number of different species on Earth. That's part of it, but not the whole story. Biodiversity includes three components: genetic diversity, species diversity, and ecological diversity. Which of the three components of biodiversity is reflected in the photo on this slide? You should be able to clearly define each component of biodiversity and give examples. If you cannot do so, go back to the textbook, look up the definitions, and write them in your notes. So why is biological diversity important? Well, there are many reasons. First, let's consider genetic diversity. The variation of genetic material within a population can make a population much more resistant to disease and other environmental stresses. For example, if all individuals in a population were genetically the same, disease or drought might easily wipe out an entire population. However, if each individual in a population is genetically unique, some individuals may have the ability to survive the disease, drought, etc. Additionally, since they survive, they can pass along these desirable traits to their offspring. I've just shown three agricultural plants here: bananas, rice, and corn. But the same premise goes for other plants, animals, including humans, bacteria, etc. Genetic variation makes a population more resistant and able to adapt. Let's consider agriculture for a moment. Genetic diversity provides us with food security and potential new food sources. Can you think of agricultural systems that promote genetic diversity? Can you think of agricultural systems that detract from genetic diversity? What are the pros and cons of each? Interestingly, in some ways, big agribusiness does not seem to value or support genetic diversity. They create a genetically modified crop, resistant to a particular pest or herbicide, and then patent it and sell it in the hopes that as many farmers as possible use this one specific variant. Next time you go to Safeway, check out how many different types of tomatoes or potatoes you find there. It's surprisingly small. Next, let's look at species diversity. Species diversity allows for redundancy and overlapping of ecological niches within an ecosystem. If a wide variety of species exist, an ecosystem is more resistant to stress and more resilient, better able to recover, after a stress event. In an ecosystem with high species diversity, if one species is eliminated, there will be another or several other species able to perform the same role, and the ecosystem will continue to function. With low species diversity, an entire community may collapse if one population is removed or reduced in size. Further, species diversity within an ecosystem may also create more niches. Consider different types of forest. Perhaps a forest with one type of tree versus a forest with 10 or 20 different types of trees, each with a different height, a different flower, a different fruit type, a different canopy shape, etc. Many natural ecosystems have great species diversity, though some do have less. How about Mono Lake? Consider the food web you drew last week. Lastly, let's look at ecological diversity. Why is ecological diversity important? Ecological diversity allows for redundancy at a higher level. For example, there are many different types of forest ecosystems. For example, the forests on the west side of the Sierras are much different than those on the east side of the Sierras, or those in Oregon or Minnesota or Florida. Each forest performs similar functions, but each also has its own species makeup and relationships. Further, the nearby ecosystems, shrublands, grasslands, or deserts, may have some, but not all, of the same functions as well. Also, each of these different forests may provide slightly different ecosystem services. Let's look at ecosystem services. Here's your textbook definition: essential ecological processes that make life on Earth possible. And then let's check out infographic 12.2, that breaks down these ecosystem services into 3 categories. First, cultural benefits. Reading through that list, you can say that these benefits are really hard to put a monetary value on. However, that does not diminish their importance. Next, check out human provisions. Indeed, these items are an integral part of our very existence. Food, fiber, fuel, industrial materials, medicines, scientific research, new products. When we think of all these human uses, we naturally think of species richness. However, we must also consider the importance of genetic diversity. Through natural selection, genetic diversity allows for the development of new traits and even new species. Humans have figured out an incredible number of ways to use and even mimic the natural world, but we still cannot create new genes. We still cannot create genetic diversity. So when we look at this list of human provisions, we also have to think of future medicines and future products that we may be able to use. Lastly, ecosystem regulation and support. This last category is huge. If we were to try to put a monetary value on it, the value is likely greater than all the money on Earth. Despite this, our current economic and political systems do not do a good job of internalizing these values into our economic decision-making process. Thus, we end up acting in a non-sustainable manner. Remember our discussion on this early in the semester. If we were truly able to put the correct value on all these services, our world would function in a much more sustainable manner. Let's work towards that goal. I encourage you to think about the ecosystems around where you live. Consider both the more natural ecosystems, the local forests, grasslands, beaches, etc., and the more engineered systems, like your yard or garden, the side of the highway, or the runoff pond near a parking lot. How would you describe the biodiversity of each? What services does each ecosystem provide? Can you give examples of how they are or are not able to resist environmental stress? And how they are or are not able to bounce back after a stress? Before you go on, consider stopping the video and making sure that you can define biodiversity, you can identify several reasons why it's important, and you can list several ecosystem services for a specific ecosystem. The remainder of this video is focused on declining biodiversity, and you'll need to keep in mind all 3 aspects of biodiversity as we discuss this. First of all, a few definitions. An endangered species is one that's in imminent danger of extinction throughout all or a significant portion of its range. A threatened species is one that's likely to become endangered in the foreseeable future. Notably, in both cases, there's a loss of biodiversity. Even though the species still exists, it has not yet gone extinct, there is a loss of genetic diversity. Even if the population recovers back to its original numbers, it won't have the same genetic diversity as it started out with. And this is called the bottleneck effect. I encourage you to go back to study infographic 11.5 in your textbook. So where is declining biodiversity the greatest problem? Well, scientists have identified many biodiversity hotspots around the world. Hotspots are areas that contain a high number of endemic but endangered species. Endemic species are those that exist only in that one location. Globally, many of these hotspots exist in tropical rainforest regions. Since areas with high ecological diversity often have many unique habitats and niches, they also have a large number of endemic species that are specially adapted to that locale and found nowhere else on Earth. In the United States, we have 2 known hotspots, Hawaii and California. So wow, many of you live in a biodiversity hotspot, where a large number of endemic but yet endangered species exist. Check out infographic 12.4 in your textbook, and check out the number of endemic species and threatened species in a few of the hotspots that they note. In the United States, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is responsible for listing endangered and threatened terrestrial species. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration is responsible for listing marine species. Check out their websites. For this week's assignment, or exam, depending on the semester, you will be asked to research an endangered species in your state. Notably, California and Hawaii each have over 300 listed species. They're hotspots. Other states generally have fewer than 24 species each. Take a few moments now to explore the Fish and Wildlife Service website. Use the State Search drop-down menu to find an endangered species. And note that on the Fish and Wildlife Service website, the species are marked T for threatened and E for endangered, so be sure you pick an endangered species. And then answer the questions shown on this slide. Pause the video here to do this basic research. Again, pause the video and do this research. You're likely to encounter this sort of question on our next exam. You'll want to have your notes handy and be prepared to answer this essay question quickly. So what are the causes of species endangerment? Well, your book identifies 5 major causes, and they're worth repeating here. First, habitat destruction and fragmentation and overall degradation. Unfortunately, humans are pros at destroying habitat. As noted previously, our economic decision-making processes do not properly value biodiversity. Thus, we destroy habitat in the name of development, even though we are actually destroying ecosystem services that may be much more valuable than the economic value of the development. Notably, habitat fragmentation can be nearly as damaging as complete destruction, especially for core species or for populations that require large ranges or have specialized breeding grounds. Invasive species are another major cause. An invasive species is a non-native species whose introduction causes economic or environmental harm or harm to human health. In Chapter 11 in your textbook, the scientists deduced that the loss of the bird populations on Guam were due to an invasive species, the brown tree snake. Invasive species are often so harmful because they have no predators in their new community, and/or their new prey species are not well adapted to avoid predation. There are many, many examples of invasive species. Next, climate change. Historically, habitat destruction and invasive species have been considered the 2 most important causes of species endangerment and extinction. However, some would argue that climate change may actually start to lead the list. Notably, climate change can cause habitat destruction and also make conditions more favorable for invasive species. We will discuss climate change in more detail later in the course. A 4th cause, pollution, exists in many forms and contributes to the loss of species worldwide. And lastly, overharvesting. You probably think of poaching of elephants for their tusks or rhinos for their horns or other ungulates and predator animals for their body parts for touted medicinal purposes. But also consider the exotic pet trade, birds and tropical fish, as well as the simple overharvesting for food and fiber. So what can we all do about declining biodiversity? Quite a bit, actually. Go back and look through those 5 causes. Anything you can do to limit habitat destruction, invasive species, climate change, pollution, or overharvesting will help decrease the loss of biodiversity. Additionally, you can simply educate your friends and family. You can join and actively support conservation organizations. And you can let your lawmakers know that biodiversity is important. Indeed, what you do matters, and you can make a difference, locally and globally. Locally, our local Mid-Peninsula Regional Open Space District is a good place to start your exploration. Check it out.